terror and heartbreak. The second mass murder in as many weeks.
Every time we turned on the news and we heard of another shooting that could never happen here, it happened here. It happened here, and it took my baby. He was my life. All my kids are my life, but losing that little piece of my heart, I lost my son.
In Uvalde, Texas, 19 children and 2 teachers gunned down in the second deadliest school shooting in a decade.
To lose a child is like having a piece of your soul ripped away.
Once again, we grieve for the little boys and girls.
Guns shouldn't be as easily accessible. Like, it's easier to get a gun than baby formula right now.
Grief over the tragic loss of lives.
The on-scene commander considered a barricaded subject and that there was time and there were no more children at risk. Having the benefit of hindsight where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period.
An outrage as police admit mistakes were made in the response. Plus,
what are we doing? Nowhere else do little kids go to school thinking that they might be shot that day.
We have to harden these targets so no one can get in.
The political debate over gun laws intensifies. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Washington Week. This has been an incredibly tough week for so many. Yet again, our nation is mourning after another mass shooting. Not even 2 weeks ago, in Buffalo, New York, a white supremacist targeting African Americans shot to death 10 people. Now another community in Uvalde, Texas is also reeling. There on Tuesday, an 18-year-old gunman stormed into Robb Elementary School and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. The stories from the carnage are heartbreaking. One student described seeing her best friend shot to death while the friend was trying to call 911. Another said she smeared the blood of a murdered classmate on her body and played dead to survive. The family of one teacher, Irma Garcia, said police told them her lifeless body was found embracing her students in a final act of comfort. Here's another account from Jarrett Hernandez, whose little brother, a second grader, survived the shooting.
He told me when he was, at the moment he was at lunch when he heard, like when he was going back to his class, and I asked him if he heard like anything. He just said he just heard screaming and gunshots firing.
This tragedy is the deadliest school shooting since the 2012 massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. On Tuesday, from the White House, President Biden urged the nation to turn pain into action.
Why? Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen? Where in God's name is our backbone to have the courage to deal with it and stand up to the lobbies?
Previous efforts to pass gun reforms after similar mass tragedies have failed over and over again. Still this week on Capitol Hill, a bipartisan group of lawmakers meant to see what new gun laws might be possible. Yet some Republicans have already made it very, very clear that they oppose any changes to the way Americans access guns. Here's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
You see politicians try to politicize it. You see Democrats and a lot of folks in the media whose immediate solution is to try to restrict the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens.
Meanwhile, this weekend, Cruz and some other Republicans, including former President Trump, gathered 4 hours away from Uvalde in Houston for an annual meeting held by the National Rifle Association. We'll get into all of this and more tonight as we discuss this. First, joining us from Uvalde, Texas, John Burnett. He's a Southwest correspondent for NPR. Jake Sherman, founder of the political newsletter Punchbowl News. And joining me here in studio, Zolan, Kanno-Youngs, White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Ashley Parker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Thank you, all of you, for joining me. It's been a heavy week, so I appreciate you taking the time. Of course, John, I want to start with you. You're there in Uvalde, Texas. Talk to me about what sticks with you as you think about the people that you've talked to in that grieving community and then the connection that so many there have to this tragedy.
Yeah, thanks for including me, Yamiche. Everyone does know someone who was touched by the tragedy here in Uvalde. It's a town of only 16,000 people, about 80% Mexican American. And every single interview that I did, they knew someone, or they knew a family, or they had some attachment to the tragedy. Even last night, after interviews, we went to a taco truck in Uvalde to buy some carne guisada, and we talked to Francisco, who runs it, and he said some of the little children were my customers, and they would buy raspas, shaved ice from me. And his eyes got wide, and he stammered for the right words, and he said, "You just can't understand. Nothing like this have ever happened in Uvalde before." They're just stunned. They're incomprehending about what has happened here. I mean, the most excitement down, in town is usually Border Patrol chases of human smugglers through down the main street. So, all of the words that we grope for, traumatized, they just seem to fall short of how people are experiencing this new reality here.
Just heartbreaking thinking about what that community is going through and what it will go through for the rest of the lives of those little children. John, I want to stick with you because the other topic that has to be discussed here is the police response. I have to look down at my notes because police did not enter the classroom until, and I almost didn't believe it unless I read it, 78 minutes after that gunman entered that school. In that time, students were calling 911 from the classroom. Parents were being handcuffed and tasered outside, or being threatened with being tasered outside, begging for cops to go in. Please talk to me a little bit about what the latest is here when it comes to the mistakes that the police admit that they made.
Well, we heard from the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, Steve McCraw, today. I think you had some tape of him at the top of the show that, from the benefit of hindsight, it was the wrong decision. There's no excuse for that. And I think what's maddening to people is how the story has continued to change. First, we heard there was a school resource officer who was outside. Then we heard that they all were inside the hallways, and then they had to get a janitor to let them in. And meanwhile, you had these families, and I've talked to some of them who were just beside themselves trying to get in to get their children. And some were being, as you said, held back. So I think there was a lot of disappointment, to put it mildly, with the law enforcement response, especially with the Uvalde school system, which had touted its police department, its officers, that they had trained for these kinds of things, and they were ready for these sorts of things. And obviously, they were not. And so there's just a lot of deep anger and frustration mixed with the grief here on the ground in Uvalde.
And Zolan, deep anger and frustration is just understandable given the idea that police officers, they said, had at least 19 officers standing in the hallway, and they waited until they found a janitor with a key to go into that classroom. You've been talking to national security experts and policing sources. Talk to me a little bit about, one, how this happens, given the fact that there are policies in place that make it very clear what to do in an active shooter situation.
How this situation happened, I mean, when I talk to police experts, most of them are asking that same question. Because when you look at the situation in place here with 19 officers outside and the evidence that at least came out today, nothing of it adds up to or results in a barricade situation. Now, today the police officials said that someone on the ground deemed this a barricade situation, that being somebody is locking themselves in a room and presenting no imminent danger to those around them. How do you square that with somebody with a weapon, with a gun, inside a room, locking themselves inside a room while children are surrounding that person, calling 911 with gunshots in the background? As soon as you let alone hear a scream that might indicate that there's a threatening situation or an imminent danger to those around you, we have seen in the past that police forces have no issue rushing in when they deem to find an imminent danger, even in times where it's not warranted. So in a situation like this, it just doesn't add up how that calculation was made there. And you did see them come out today and say that that call was wrong. But still, there's going to be a lot of questions here of what did those 19 police officers know? If you could hear gunshots on the 911 call, I don't understand how you couldn't hear them if you're in the hallway outside of that classroom.
And Ashley, before I talk to you about the White House's point of view in terms of what they want to do on guns, I have to, a tweet that you put up, it struck me. You said, I'm waiting to see and eager to see what the accountability story is for policing. So talk to me a bit about what you're hearing from your sources in Washington, at the White House, just on this discrepancy, these mistakes that police made.
Well, what you're seeing would be a Keystone Cops comedy of errors, but for the fact that 19 children are dead. And it's, as Zolan said, it's not just one mistake. As we watched the press conference today, the latest bit of beginning to be accurate information, it was mistake after mistake after mistake, and then several days where they misled the public, right? Their initial accounts, and this goes to the fact that police accounts are not always accurate. And sometimes that's very fair because in a fast-moving situation, witnesses are not always reliable. They're getting information in real time. But it went from sort of being a tale of heroism of the police force down there to the fact that you had as many police officers as children who ended up dying, and they all did, according to these accounts we're hearing, just about nothing to try to save those lives.
Everything points the situation to this being an active shooter situation. And after the Columbine shooting, there was supposed to be a pivot in police training. And you did see training here where you went from isolating and containing somebody to actually rushing in and stopping that person with the weapon immediately. How it was deemed that this was a barricaded situation, somewhat a barricaded subject, and not an active shooter situation, that's a question that you're seeing the highest ranks of police officials ask at this point. When former Commissioner Bill Bratton is also saying that this was an embarrassment for the police, somebody who has staunchly defended police officers in the past, even in sensitive situations.
And just adding about what's being talked about in Washington, you're seeing people talk about what we're seeing in the news reports, which is that there, as you mentioned earlier, there were parents outside who seemed to have a sort of more visceral gut instinct of what to do, which was to race into the school and try to save the children. And that was what the police initially were using their time and effort to prevent against, from parents, desperate parents trying to save their children.
Well, I want to ask you one other quick thing before I go to Jake Sherman, which is, Ashley, President Biden has been here before. He's talked about gun reform. He's passed some executive orders. What is the strategy at the White House to try to get something passed in Congress, because they're going to have to put pressure on lawmakers here?
Well, I don't want to take too long, but very briefly, President Biden has had a front row seat in the decades since Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook happens. President Obama at the time, 5 days after Sandy Hook, holds a press conference where he deputizes Biden, then his vice president, to sort of be the gun czar. He doesn't use that word, but Biden comes up within a month a proposal. One ends up with 23 executive actions that Obama signs, and the parallel track that, as we all know, ended up failing is what ends up being pretty modest, almost to the point of toothlessness in the view of some gun control advocates, Manchin-Toomey background checks bill. And Biden was not instrumental to its failure, but he was certainly a key person in this bill that went down. And now as president, he also finds himself in this situation where he's somewhat helpless and almost impotent to do anything when the real action is going to be in Congress. And as we've seen before, he has very little sway there.
And Jake, actually saying the real action will be in Congress, which is, of course, the beat that you own. You've been talking to lawmakers all week. Is there going to be real action in Congress? What's your sense of what lawmakers could possibly agree on, especially when it comes to red flag laws or other things?
At the risk of sounding naive, Yamiche, and thanks for having me, I do feel as if this is a little bit different than it has been in the past. I do feel as if the efforts right now are more serious than they've been before, just because you have a lot of Republicans in the room. So if you look at the lowest common denominator, which you have to do now, you have to look at the easiest, lowest hanging fruit is those red flag laws, those laws that will allow police in localities and municipalities and states to confiscate guns. And Congress is not going to what they might do is they might allow states to draw down on grants from the federal government to allow red flag systems to be put in place. And following up on what Ashley said, I mean, I would say that if I were a Democrat, and I've heard this from Democrats on Capitol Hill, I would tell the president to stay as far away from this as humanly possible. Number one, he has 33, 35 to 40% approval ratings, which is abysmal. He's deeply unpopular at this point, and he's failed in the past at gun reform. So he doesn't bring anything to the table that's really of interest to Republicans. And of course, in a 50-50 Senate, you need 10 Republicans to get a bill across the floor. There are, of the 50 Republicans in the Senate, there are 35 who will never, ever support gun reform. So you have to work from that 15 and then take 10 from there. So Biden is not going to be persuasive here. But I really do think, and again, this is just on body language, on watching people on the Hill, on talking to Republican members of the Senate, that there is a pretty good chance of a modest gun reform package. I think the shock of the shootings in Buffalo and in Uvalde, I feel like this is a different kind of moment for this Congress. And again, these might be famous last words, but I just do get that sense this time around.
Well, as you're talking about sort of this changing and maybe there being some movement here, I want to put up some graphics that show what's really going on in America. First, mass shootings are a uniquely American problem. Here's a list of shootings in developed countries from 1998 to 2019. The U.S. has had 101. The next up is France with just 8 mass shootings. I also want to put up this graph. It shows that in 2001, school shootings hit an all-time high. There were 236 of them, more than double the years before. John, I want to come to you because, of course, you are in that community where people are impacted by this. What are people saying they want to see in Uvalde? This is obviously rural Texas, so there is a gun culture there. What are you hearing as people in D.C. are debating here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's kind of complicated. There's kind of a disconnect in some ways between the culture that you're hearing about in your environment and down here. This is gun culture. This is a huge hunting community. As a guy who owns a construction company told me yesterday, everybody owns guns down here. This is rural Texas. I interviewed a school superintendent who in a neighboring school district who is keenly conscious of all these threats to his students and is doing his best to secure his schools. He has AR-15s. He likes to use them for target shooting. And so when I talk to people down here, and again, this is just the folks I'm talking to, not necessarily everyone's going to say this, but I find that a lot of the rage seems to be directed at the local response that we've been talking to up to now and how the school handled this. And I don't hear people talking as much about, national legislation that we need to raise the purchase of long guns in Texas from 18 to 21, which is what they did in Florida, even in that conservative state after they had a school shooting there. Or universal background checks. I mean, the Texas politicians, the Republicans who run state government here, they always talk about hardening the schools. We heard Ted Cruz earlier, and they absolutely, it's just kryptonite. They will not talk about strengthening gun laws. And but oddly, here in town, or maybe not oddly, I mean, you hear people that are, they want better school security. They want their children to be protected by the school authorities and better school cops, definitely after this episode.
And Zolan, you're going to be you're going down to Uvalde while President Biden is going to be traveling there. What's your sense of whether or not there might be any sort of executive action or any sort of things that he might be able to do alone?
I doubt that in the short term, that's announced in an address this weekend. I think you can just look to the president's comments when he, during the Buffalo trip, when he went to go and comfort families of victims in Buffalo. I was on that trip as well, and right before he boarded Air Force One, he was asked, what kind of executive action can you take here? And he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he did say, look, I mean, I don't have many options here, and kind of diverted and deferred, saying, really, the action needs to happen in Congress. Now, I did see some press releases and as well and some more statements today, now that a couple days have passed, from some more advocacy organizations that are calling for some action, appointing a gun czar. You were mentioning that happened in the past, or a form of it. Trying to form a task force here. Also changing the definition of gun sellers in a way so that you can have stricter regulation in that way. It'll be interesting to see, though, how the president balances, one, empathizing with families, which we've seen that's where he's very strong. Yeah. Balancing that with calling for action, and also balancing how he addresses the police response as well.
And Jake, I want to come to you when it comes to sort of the conversation here, because Republicans are gathering at the NRA. You said that you've mentioned that there is a sort of myth of the NRA, that the GOP is the NRA. Speak a little bit about the political significance of Republicans gathering there.
You know, the NRA is an example, Yamiche, I think, in today's politics of a group that is basically where most conservatives are. I mean, Republicans at the moment are second, as we put it in the newsletter this morning, Second Amendment absolutists. So it's not as if the Republicans need to go to the NRA to get kind of a dispensation to pass gun laws. The last time the NRA took a staunch position against a piece of gun legislation was the so-called Fix NICS Act, which was in the Trump administration, which was, just to put it simply, basically some sort of a background check system. The NRA lobbied heavily against it, and Republicans were able to get it across the finish line. Donald Trump signed it into law. I just think that people don't appreciate that the NRA is one of the many groups in D.C. that just takes a position where most people are, and claims it as their own, and claims that they are causing that position, I guess, is the best way to say it. I think right now, Republicans can, because Democrats are being reasonable here, Yamiche. This is the interesting thing. Democrats traditionally have tried to swing for the fences when it comes to gun control. Now they are taking a very minimalist position. We want to stop people who are mentally ill or looking to hurt themselves or others from owning guns. We want to take guns away from them. Republicans feel, from the Republicans I've spoken to, that standing against that is not a sustainable position, considering Republicans have supported that for years. So that is the situation at the moment.
And really quickly, John, because I want to get one last question into Zolan, but John, just how are people feeling there, the faith to go on? In a couple seconds, if you can.
You know, I covered a number of these small town school shootings, Yamiche, and it's the very unity that you first asked me about, and the sense of close knit that that helps them get through this, because they really do support each other and they know each other. Yeah. And so this happened in Sutherland Springs and in Santa Fe, Texas, also, and frankly. Tons of people go to church here, and so they feel like this is what they hear on Sunday mornings about the nature of evil, and now they've witnessed true evil, and so it strengthens their faith as well. So this is going to be a scar forever here, but it's I do think folks will recover.
And quickly, Zolan, the president did sign this policing EO. We only have about 30 seconds left, but I want to just let you weigh in on this second anniversary of George Floyd's murder.
Yeah, the action that the president took on the second anniversary will mostly have an immediate impact on federal law enforcement agencies. But one thing that the administration has been pointing to, which some advocacy organizations are also saying should not just be washed over, is this database as well that can track police officers. One thing that doesn't get talked about as much as use of force is how police officers can be fired for misconduct and moved to another department.
And Ashley, he's trying to do something, essentially.
Yeah, he is. This is very clearly a priority for him, but it's a very polarized issue that, again, for a decade, he and Democrats and gun control groups have simply struggled with.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to John, to Jake, to Zolan, and Ashley for joining us and for sharing your reporting. We'll continue our conversation on the Washington Week Extra. We'll break down the Georgia primary results and how the recent mass shootings might impact the midterms. Find it on our website, Facebook, and YouTube. And tune in Saturday to PBS News Weekend for the latest on the ground in Uvalde, Texas. And finally, our hearts at Washington Week are breaking for the families in Uvalde. This is a nightmare that no one should have to live through. My prayers are with that community and so many others in mourning across our country. Thank you for joining us. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewens with the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.